Good morning. Will you open your Bibles to Luke chapter 7? Luke chapter 7, I want to read the account this morning about the widow's son at Nain. As we prepare our minds for the Lord's Supper, I want us to think about a funeral and a feast. And as you're turning to Luke 7, before we get to the story there, I want us to consider how odd it is that every first day of the week we participate in a funeral and a feast at the same time. The Lord's Supper is meant to be eaten at the same time that we are commemorating the Lord's death. Now, Dwayne and I, we met with Jenny Geiger last week to help prepare for Irene's funeral this afternoon. And Jenny told us, we were kind of blown away by this, Jenny told us one time she actually went to a funeral where the reception was sort of open, and so people could just get up anytime they wanted it and get food and bring it back to their table. And so people were actually eating during the eulogy and like during the actual time of remembrance and the service part. And, you know, when we hear that, it doesn't really sit right with us. It seems kind of disrespectful. I mean, you're there to try to honor the one who has passed, but eating during the service, that seems like it's treating the occasion way too casually. That's why typically we'll have the funeral service and then afterwards, we'll have a reception and eat together. In the Mishnah, which is a collection of Jewish writings from around 200 AD, and there is some debate, some question about whether the things that they were practicing at that time were already being practiced in the first century. It's hard to know sometimes. But in that writing, they mention something called a meal of consolation. They too would separate the funeral service from a meal that they would call the meal of consolation. And they'd only have that meal after the service. In fact, that meal of consolation would usually be the first of many meals over a period of 7 days of mourning. You would have friends and family members and neighbors bring food to those who were in mourning for this 7-day period, sort of as an act of communal solidarity and lament. But they never ate a meal during the service. So again, what we're doing with the Lord's Supper is actually incredibly odd. But I think that the story in Luke 7 helps shed light on why the Lord's Supper is both a funeral and a feast. It's because when Jesus goes to funerals, those funerals are not typical at all. And he radically changes the service for the better. Luke chapter 7, verse 11 says, "Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd." Now pause here, because at this point in Luke's gospel, people are still trying to figure Jesus out. Who is this guy? Is he really the Messiah that we've been waiting for? In fact, even John the Baptist, a relative of Jesus, is questioning if Jesus really is the one that they should be expecting. So look in same chapter, drop down to verse 20 through 23, because John the Baptist is in prison, and he sends messengers to Jesus, and it says in verse 20, when the men came to him, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to you to ask, are you the expected one, or do we look for someone else?" And at that very time, he cured many people of diseases and afflictions and evil spirits, and he gave sight to many who were blind. And he answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. Blessed is he who does not take offense at me." So what Luke is doing is showing us, leading up to the moment of John's question, that Jesus is indeed healing sicknesses and raising the dead. In the story right before the widow's son at Nain, Jesus healed the sickness of a centurion servant who was right on the brink of death. And now he's going to save someone from death itself to prove that he is indeed the expected one. So look back at verse 12 as we continue. "Now as he approached the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and the sizable crowd from the city was with her." I think it's important to pause and appreciate the gravity of the situation. First of all, in Luke's gospel, he puts a lot of emphasis on Jesus caring for the nobodies in society. And you got to know, Nain is just this small, obscure, rural village. So Jesus isn't out going to the big cities to find all the rich and really important people. He's out here in this village. And he sees this sort of nobody of a woman in terms of how society would describe her, and yet he cares for her, and he sees that her heart is absolutely devastated. The Jews buried their dead on the same day that they died, which means she literally just lost her son, probably that morning. No parent should ever have to bury their child. But this wasn't just any child. This was her only son. And this wasn't just any woman. She was a widow. And in the first century world, women did not have the same economic opportunities that women do today. And so they would typically be supported financially by their husband. And if their husband died, well, then they would be supported financially by their sons. But now, because they didn't have social safety nets in their society the way we do today, she's lost her husband. And now she's lost her only son. And unless she has other family members to take care of her, she's in extremely dire straits financially. And she is going to be struggling the rest of her life just to survive. One writer said there are two dead people in this story. The son who is dead and this woman who is dead inside. On top of her pain and shock, she would be feeling a sense of fear and hopelessness about the future. But there's something she didn't know. Jesus was at this funeral. And so let's finish reading 13 down to 17. When the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." And he came up and touched the coffin. And the bearers came to a halt. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him back to his mother. Fear gripped them all, and they began glorifying God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report concerning him went out all over Judea and in all the surrounding district. When Jesus saw the depths of her pain and the hopelessness of her future, his heart melted with compassion. He felt her pain in the depths of his bones, and it moved him to radically change this funeral and this woman's life in an instant. Now, I realize the text does not say anything about a feast, but what do you think this woman and her friends and neighbors would have done upon receiving this good news about her son coming back to life? They absolutely would have feasted in celebration. And let me prove it to you this way. Remember, last Sunday, Herb talked to us about the parables of the lost sheep and coin and of the prodigal son. Notice, turn to Luke 15. And look again at what the father said when his son returned home. In Luke 15, verses 22 to 24. Luke 15, 22. But the father said to his slaves, "Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fattened calf, kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found," and they began to celebrate. Now, for this father, he was only being figurative. It was as if his son had been dead and had come back to life. But for this widow at Nain, her son literally was dead and literally did come back to life. How much more would she and her friends and neighbors be celebrating? In fact, if they were already planning to have 7 days worth of meals as an act of consolation and lament, it only makes sense that they probably would have still had those meals. It's just Jesus has now transformed those meals from consolation meals to celebration meals. Because Jesus turned this funeral into a feast. And he did that in 4 ways. Number one, the focus of this funeral was on Jesus' grace, not her son's greatness. In the story before this with the centurion servant, there's two major differences here between this story and that one. Number one, the centurion servant was just on the brink of death. He wasn't actually dead, but this man actually was dead. But secondly, the centurion, he actually sent servants to go find Jesus. And when they found Jesus, you know what they did? They made a case for how worthy the centurion is of Jesus' help. They said, look, he's a great man. He's done great things, and he's helped the Jews build a synagogue. He is absolutely worthy of you to come and help him, Jesus. But in this story, they don't ask Jesus for help at all. The widow does not ask Jesus for help. Nobody asked Jesus for help. And there's nothing here about how great this woman's son was. Jesus simply takes it upon himself to help as an act of pure grace and compassion. Without Jesus, funerals are depressing because all we have to hold on to is the greatness of the one who died. And while they may have done great things in their life, everybody sitting at that funeral knows that person had flaws, that person had failures, that person had sins. And we're just sort of counting on, well, maybe their good works and their greatness is outweighing their bad works. But there's no real certainty in that. And so when you go to a funeral for somebody who's not a Christian, it sounds a lot like we're just sort of trying to console ourselves. We're sort of trying to look on the bright side and all of that, but it's not real. You don't really have any grounding for hope. But as a Christian, with Jesus at your funeral, the focus is not on your greatness at all. It's on his grace and compassion. And in fact, I've seen some Christian funerals. I was kind of surprised with this, but I was seeing some Christian funerals where they're very honest about the flaws of the person who died, and they sort of share some of those. And I was kind of surprised, like, wow, usually we don't do that, right? We don't want to talk about the flaws. We only want to talk about the great things. But they were actually very open about talking about the flaws and failures and sins. Why? Because they could still take comfort in knowing they're going to be resurrected in the end because of Jesus' grace, despite their sins and their flaws and their failures. So it's an amazing hope. Because with Jesus at your funeral, it's not about you. It's about him and what he's done for you. He turns funerals into feasts that way. Secondly, he turned this funeral into a feast because grief was not the end. In verse, it's very interesting. If you go back to Luke 7 in verse 13, when he sees her and he feels compassion for her, he says to her, "Do not weep." Now, typically, if we see someone who's suffering, especially from the loss of a child, that's probably one of the most insensitive things you could ever say to somebody. To walk up and say, "Don't cry." What are you talking about? Don't cry. This is the most painful moment of my life. One writer said this: the death of a child is certainly one of the greatest agonies possible in this life. A burying of a part of oneself, a period before the end of a sentence, the death of a future. It is a burden that all parents fear. Yet Jesus walks up to her and says, "Stop weeping." Now, maybe to our modern ears, we might hear that and think he's shaming her. Suck it up, right? It's not that bad. The pain's not that terrible. That's not what he's saying at all. He's not telling her that she should not have been crying, but that she shouldn't cry any longer, because he's about to remove the reason for her tears. And he raises her son from the dead. And you better believe, and I wish it says he got up and spoke. I would love to be there and know what he said when he actually got up. Hey, but you better believe she stopped weeping. Now, she may have been crying still, but they would have been tears of joy, not tears of sorrow. And this is meant as a foretaste of the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation 21:4, where it says, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. So now it is true, we are still going to cry at funerals, because our loved ones are not going to be instantaneously resurrected like this woman's son was. That would be nice. But It's meant to prove what Jesus did here with the widow's son. It's meant to prove that one day they will be resurrected. And when you have Jesus at your funeral, grief is not the end. Thirdly, he turned this funeral into a feast because what was lost was restored to her. In verse 15, the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. The Bible describes our ultimate hope as the restoration of all things. With Jesus at your funeral, nothing is ever lost. All will be restored. This is why as Christians, when we die, we grieve, yes, but Paul says we grieve not as those who have no hope, because we know the funeral isn't the end of our story. Our story ends with a heavenly feast for all eternity. And then finally this morning, the only way that heavenly feast is possible is through Jesus' funeral. In verse 14, it says he came up and touched the coffin. Now, this was not a coffin with a lid on it. It was more like a stretcher, a burial board meant to carry the corpse to the grave. Well, under the law of Moses, if you were to touch one of these coffins, one of these burial boards, you would be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. And so you would avoid touching it unless you absolutely had to. Now the pallbearers, they have to, right? We got to get the body to the grave. So yeah, there's kind of no choice. We're gonna have to touch this thing, and then we're gonna have to wait 7 days and go through all the purification rituals at the table and all that stuff. Jesus, he did not have to touch that coffin. We've already seen him. He heals people from a distance. He didn't have to physically walk up there and touch this coffin, but he voluntarily chose to take the uncleanness of death upon himself so her son could live. He was willing to touch death for her. And instead of death making Jesus unclean, Jesus made death clean by turning it to life. And it was a foreshadowing of his willingness to touch death for us all so that we could live. But in our case, Jesus didn't just touch a grave, he went to the grave. Jesus didn't just touch a burial board, he was carried on one himself. And yet 3 days later, he rose from the dead, radically changing his own funeral forever. And after his resurrection, it's interesting how many times Luke shows him sharing meals with his disciples. After his resurrection, he is feasting, and the funeral was not the end for him. And so his funeral was turned to a feast because death was turned to life. So why in the world do we eat while we remember Jesus' death? Why do we feast at a funeral? It's because, number one, his funeral is no ordinary funeral. It is a funeral that ended with resurrection and life and celebration, not grief and death. The feast reminds us the funeral was not the end for Jesus, but just a very brief part of his story. And then finally, it's not just his resurrection that makes the feast possible, but the funeral itself. Because it was his death on the cross that offers us forgiveness and reconciliation with the Father. So while we do grieve over his horrendous death and crucifixion, we feast in celebration of our cleansing. We feast in celebration of his resurrection and ultimately of our own resurrection when one day, by the grace of Jesus, he changes our funeral to a feast and restores all that has been lost to us and wipes every tear from our eyes so that we'll never have to weep again. At the Lord's Supper, it's a funeral and a feast.